Good morning, everyone. Um, so this is a webinar on migrating SQL workloads to Azure. We're not going to go into excruciating detail on this, but if you have any questions about something specific that I don't cover, please bring those up. My name is Paul Burpo. I'm a Principal Cloud Solutions Architect here at Opsgility. I'm also a Microsoft Certified Trainer. I have various Microsoft certifications in data engineering, Azure architecture, and AI engineering. Prior to coming to work for Opsgility, I was at Microsoft for about 15 years. After that, I worked in retail for the IT side of a retail company moving into Azure. After that, I worked for a fintech startup doing big data in Azure. And for the last 5 years, I've been here at Opsgility teaching companies how to migrate to the cloud and how to leverage cloud services in Azure. So what we're going to cover today, we're going to start off by looking at different ways you can run SQL Server in Azure. This is kind of a prerequisite to doing any type of migration because you have some options that you'll have to take a look at when moving into Azure for SQL databases. Then we'll take a look at the database migration tools, and I'll give you guys kind of an overview of the primary tools that we use in database migration. And then I'll do a quick demo of one of the tools. And then time permitting, I'm going to cover some advanced database migration options. It might be more accurate to call these alternate database migration options that you might use in situations where the tooling doesn't do quite what you need it to do. So, I'm not going to go into too much detail on those alternate options, just to let you know that those are out there, so that if the tooling that Microsoft provides doesn't do exactly what you need it to do, it doesn't quite meet your requirement, you can always go and sort of customize your own migration tooling to help you do the migration. So first, let's talk about running SQL in Azure. So you have basically three options for running SQL Server in Azure. You have SQL Server on virtual machines. You have Azure SQL managed instances, and you have Azure SQL Database. And these are roughly organized from sort of least desirable on the far left to most efficient and most desirable on the far right. Now, that's not always the case. If your application is designed in such a way that you're going to have to run it on a virtual machine, that's perfectly okay. These different types of service that running in Azure are designed to fit all the different types of applications that you might have that you might want to run in the cloud. So let's take a look at each one of these three on its own. So the first is running SQL Server on Azure virtual machines. And if you're new to Azure, this is the easiest to wrap your head around. If you went through the early and mid 2000s where we did migrations from bare metal to virtual machines for most of our environments, this is going to be a very similar process, albeit a little bit more involved and a little bit steeper learning curve because you have to learn more of the cloud services. But this is effectively the same thing as what you do on premise. You're just doing it in someone else's data center. So this provides you with the greatest flexibility, the highest compatibility, but it requires you to maintain the operating system. So it has the highest administrative overhead. It also gives you the easiest migration path. It provides 100% compatibility with your on-prem environment with no code changes. I usually say near 100% compatibility because there's always something that doesn't quite work the same way when you move to the cloud. So, but this is going to be the most compatible with anything you would have on premises. All right. There are certain features that sort of pigeonhole you into running SQL Server on an Azure virtual machine. These are features like distributed transactions, or if you wanted to run SQL Server on Linux. And the reason for that is these are operating system dependent features. So when you need to control the operating system, you basically are looking at running SQL Server on a virtual machine. So in the case of something like distributed transactions, when you use a distributed transaction in a SQL Server, it actually leverages the Microsoft Distributed Transaction Coordination Service in Windows to do that. And that's why you would need to use a virtual machine if you needed access to that operating system level feature. And the reason for that, none of the other options give you direct control over the operating system. So that's the reason for that. Same for SQL on Linux. If you need to run on a very specific operating system version, then that's going to require you to run SQL Server on an Azure virtual machine. Likewise, if you have any jobs or anything else that's dependent on something in the operating system or the underlying file system, you're probably looking at running SQL Server on a virtual machine. When you're migrating from a SQL Server on-prem to an Azure virtual machine, that's also called a lift and shift. And it's one of the simplest types of migrations. If you want the minimum number of code changes and the fastest migration possible, this is what you're looking at doing. Just recently, about fall of 2019, Microsoft announced the SQL Server VM resource provider in Azure. And this gives you the ability to add some additional functionality to SQL Server virtual machines. It provides you with automated backups, database backups, allows you to leverage Azure storage for a variety of use cases. It gives you Azure Key Vault integration. So if you want to store your keys and secrets in a secure location, you can automate that integration through this VM resource provider. It also gives you better license portability as well. So you can take your on-premises licenses for SQL Server when you migrate to Azure Virtual Machines or SQL Database, and you can apply that license and get a discount on the Azure pricing up to, I believe it's up to 55% right now. So that will vary a little bit depending on what size virtual machine you're using and things like that, but it is a great benefit, and it sort of offloads some of the management overhead of running SQL Server on a virtual machine. So that's a good option there and worth looking at. The next option you have is a SQL managed instance. This is one of the newer variants of SQL in Azure. It provides you with a very easy migration path, somewhat similar to what you see in Azure virtual machines. It gives you near 100% compatibility with almost no code changes. However, unlike SQL on Azure virtual machines, the administrative overhead is reduced because Microsoft is going to maintain the underlying operating system. So it's still a fully managed solution. I liken this to similar to running SQL on a virtual machine, but Microsoft is managing the operating system on your behalf. It's not exactly like that, but it's pretty close to from a usability standpoint. If you need features like cross-database queries or SQL CLR, you won't be able to use Azure SQL Database, but you will be able to use a SQL Managed Instance for those types of migrations. So this would be a good option for that. Managed instances really came around to support that level of migration. Customers that needed to migrate to Azure, they wanted a managed solution in Azure to gain that efficiency, but they couldn't move to an Azure SQL database because it just didn't support the feature set they needed, like cross-database queries. Finally, you have Azure SQL Database. And if you are building a modern cloud-native application, this is going to be your best option and probably your go-to for those types of applications. It doesn't mean that your existing applications won't work in Azure SQL Database. Very frequently, we see customers migrating on-premises VM-based SQL instances to Azure SQL databases and leveraging things such as Elastic Pool to host lots of databases. So this is still a good option. Most of your on-prem systems will actually migrate into Azure SQL Database just fine. I'll actually demo some of that when we get into the tooling. But Azure SQL Database gives you a lot of other options. It has a serverless option, so you can use only what you pay for. It gives you a hyperscale option for very large workloads. So between these two extremes, you can cover a lot of different scenarios for Azure SQL Database. I generally recommend that customers at least investigate using Azure SQL Database, even if their comfort level is not quite there yet, because the efficiency gains can be a lot higher in something like an Azure SQL Database, where it's completely managed by Microsoft, and all you need to do is set up the database in Azure. All your backups will be taken care of automatically. The backend performance tuning and scale of the underlying hardware will be managed by Microsoft to make sure it maintains your performance targets. And if you ever run into a situation where the scalability isn't meeting your demand, you can just go in there and change the scale up, adjust the scale up, and Azure SQL Database will accommodate that additional scale. All right. So let's talk about some tooling for migration. So we know what we're going to migrate to. And those three options that you saw, SQL Server running in a virtual machine in Azure, Azure SQL Managed Instance, and SQL Database, all require some level of tooling to help you migrate. Now, you can do it manually, and I will cover that after we cover the tool-based migration options. But the tooling is designed to make it easier. I do encourage you, when you're ready to do your migration, go back, check and see if any of the tooling has been updated. The tooling is being updated constantly. So it's worth going back and reviewing that when it's time for doing the actual migration. So I always recommend that everyone use the Azure Database Migration Guide to start off. This is a great tool. You can see the link here, aka.ms/data migration, and it will give you basically a step-by-step guide for both the high-level process for migrating and the individual detailed steps, including what tools you should use and consider, and what types of things you're going to need to look out for when you're doing these types of migrations. So let's take a quick look at there we go. I'm going to take a quick look at the Azure Database Migration Guide. You can see here, I've got lots of different options for what my source database is going to be. So we're interested in migrating SQL Server workloads, but the migration guide does cover other databases like Oracle, Mongo, Cassandra, MariaDB, even table storage. So you have lots of options, and whatever your data migration path is going to be, this is probably a good place to start from. So for migrating SQL Server workloads to Azure SQL Database, which is what we're going to look at today, you can just select it, and it'll give you the high-level steps of what you're trying to do. So it always breaks out every migration option into 4 phases. The before you start, which is preparing for your migration, then your pre-migration phase, your migration phase, and your post-migration phase. And it'll give you detailed steps for each one of those. You can see it's got links to all the documentation that you might need, best practices, supportability matrices, all that. So if you go back here and look at the migration process overview, it kind of breaks each phase of the migration out for you. So pre-migration and migration phases are generally phases that everyone kind of gets right. So in the pre-migration phase, this is where you're planning. You're discovering what systems you have. You're targeting systems for migration. You're doing assessments on those systems to make sure that they don't need major changes to be compatible in Azure. You're doing conversions of any source schema to the target schema. So if you're migrating from, say, Oracle to Azure SQL Database, you would need to do schema conversion to make sure that things like data types are the same and converted correctly. The next phase will be the migration phase. And this is where you're actually migrating things like the schema, the data, and you're migrating those to whatever service you're migrating to in Azure. There's also, within that migration phase, you also have a sync data phase. Now, that sync data phase is typically used when you have large databases or databases that have very minimal downtime requirements. And in those cases, what one strategy that you might use during the migration phase is to, say, restore a backup into Azure onto let's say a SQL Server virtual machine, and then you synchronize the data periodically through log restores so that your data is more in sync. And at that point, once you do your cutover is going to be greatly reduced because you've been synchronizing data over time. And there's different ways to accomplish this. The technical details of how this migration phase happens is going to be different depending on what options you choose. If you're going to use the database migration service, data migration assistant, or if you're going to do a custom one-off with something like an availability group where you're synchronizing data and then you can cut over at the last second. The last phase is the post-migration phase. This phase is the most overlooked phase in all of cloud migrations, whether it's data or infrastructure or application migration. This is always the most overlooked phase. Once you do your migration, you're going to need to make sure that you're monitoring, you're doing remediation of any acute issues that arise, performing any functional tests and performance tests that you might be able to do to find issues before your customers find them. And then based on the results of your test and your monitoring, you're going to optimize and tweak. You're also going to do things like take advantage of additional services in Azure that you may not be able to take advantage of if you're working in an on-premises environment. So this is the time to do that. And this is a continual effort. Once you move into Azure, this post-migration phase basically encompasses the life cycle of the application for its remaining time that you'll use the service. So that's the post-migration phase. Don't forget about the post-migration phase. We get a lot of people that come to us and say, well, I've done the migration. It didn't go very well. I did a lift and shift to an Azure virtual machine, and now the Azure virtual machine is not performing as well as expected. Well, that's the type of thing you should be monitoring for. This is not like your on-premises environment where once you buy a server, that's it. You're kind of stuck with that server, and you might be able to buy more memory for it or add CPU cores to it. But this is pretty easy. Once you're in the cloud, you can scale your workloads up and down, your services up and down to accommodate your various workloads and peak times during your workloads. All right. So this is the database migration guide, and that will get you started and give you all the documentation you need to get to start planning your migration. Within that database migration guide, it's going to recommend some tooling that you might use to help get your workload into Azure, possibly to make life easier for you, help with testing. And there are more tools that I'm going to cover here. Some of them are more general in nature than others, but there are a couple of tools that you need to think about that I recommend everybody at least consider when doing a migration. So the first is the Data Migration Assistant, or DMA as it's commonly called. Keep in mind there's a Data Migration Assistant, and then there's a Database Migration Service, and they're somewhat interconnected. The Database Migration Service is used to assess on-premises SQL databases for fit in Azure and can also provide pre-staging migration capabilities such as creating database schemas in Azure SQL or in SQL on an Azure VM once you're ready to start doing the migration. Next, you'll have the Database Migration Service, and this can use the DMA as an assessment engine. So it's worth actually looking at the Database Migration Assistant, even if you're planning on doing a large migration. The Migration Service has a real sweet spot in migrating lots of databases. So if you have a directive from your upper management to migrate your entire database footprint into Azure by the end of the year, I would be looking at the database migration service. If you're only migrating a single database, I would look at the data migration assistant. And the reason for that is the data migration assistant is a lot smaller, much more easy. It's single instance focused, whereas the service is designed to evaluate an entire environment and migrate lots of databases. So they work hand in hand together. Data Migration Assistant is primarily focused on SQL. Database Migration Service can also support SQL Server, but it has support for MySQL, Postgres, and others. There's also the SQL Server Migration Assistant. This is used for migrating DB2, Oracle, SAP, Access, MySQL. I believe this tool was originally written by DBBest, which is a Microsoft partner in the consulting area. And it was originally designed to do Oracle migrations. Now it's been expanded out to cover a lot of other scenarios and to cover migrations into SQL Server running on Azure VMs and Azure SQL Database. So this is another option for those. And it helps you with things like compatibility between data types and different functions and procedures in Oracle and how they might be rewritten to operate in SQL Server. So the support matrix for these, for the database migration service, SQL 2005 or later is minimum requirement for SQL Server. You can see the other source types there. Targets can be SQL Database, Managed Instance, SQL on Azure VMs, plus the other platform as a service offering, such as Azure SQL Database for MySQL, Azure SQL Database for Postgres, and Cosmos DB. Little bit out of scope here, but Cosmos DB is the multimodal modern data platform. It's completely cloud native. It's a NoSQL database. You would typically use it to migrate things like MongoDB or Cassandra or to build cloud native applications. But it is not a relational database. It's more of a document database or a graph database or a columnar database, depending on how you set it up and configure it. So a little bit out of scope for this, but it is an option as a target database if you need that. So in your pre-migration phase, you will have an assessment that you'll need to do. And you see here, we have a screenshot of the Data Migration Assistant. I'm actually going to run through that real quick after we go through the database migration service process. The assessment is done by downloading the DMA tool. I think they're on version 5.2 now, so you'll have a tough time finding 3.3, but the data migration service requires 3.3 or higher. You specify the source and destination databases and the types. You'll select the report type, which I'll cover in the demo. You'll supply database credentials. It'll run an assessment, and then it'll let you view a report. And then at that point, you can assess any flagged issues that are caused by that are flagged by the data migration assistant. Now, a word of advice on assessments. I am not a big fan of running the assessment and then blindly migrating. I would always recommend that you run the assessment and do a test migration. That can take different forms depending on how big your database is and what the goal of the migration is. So if it's a small database, you can do a migration, leave the system online, and just go put it in Azure and then run tests in Azure. And that can help you fine-tune things like scalability before you actually migrate production applications onto it. I consider this part of the assessment. Most production environments are going to require some level of testing before they migrate to Azure. If it's a relatively unimportant database or a database that can take significant downtime, or you have very good functionality testing for it, you can actually do the migration if you have enough of a window and do your functional test after the migration, and then you don't have to do any testing pre-migration. That's great, but usually the users are pretty adamant that their database needs to work correctly as soon as you get it into Azure. So if you can get away with that, that's great, but I usually recommend additional functionality testing. The typical testing you would do on your databases after upgrading an application or upgrading a version of SQL, those types of things. Those would be appropriate at the assessment phase as well. Blocking issues that you might run into during the assessment phase are not always blockers. So sometimes the assessment tool will flag things around server level features that you're not going to migrate. So keep that in mind, and I'll show you an example of that. Those are going to be blocking issues that come up when I do the demo for the data migration assistant. The next phase will be migrating your schema using the data migration assistant. So there are a couple of options when you use the data migration assistant. If you're using the data migration service, usually you just migrate the schema only. And the reason for that is because you are looking for compatibility issues, functional compatibility issues. You're not as worried yet about scale if you're using the data migration service. You'll generate, when you generate the schema only and then you apply the schema to your cloud service, that's going to tell you that your schema is actually valid. Right there, it's going to tell you whether your schema is going to work instantly, because if it doesn't, they're not going to be able to deploy it. So that's the migrate schema phase. There is some additional testing that you might do after the schema. If you have a particularly large database, one common practice that I've seen on really large databases is to sample the data set and migrate some of the data to apply functional testing. How you sample that data set is going to be dependent on your application and what it's used for. If it's a data warehouse, it's probably going to be some of the later, most recent data. But this prevents you from having to migrate, a 100 terabyte database or a 10 terabyte database even into Azure to do any type of functional testing. That can take a long time. It can be cost prohibitive. And it also means that when you put these large data sets in there, you have to scale the testing environment up to accommodate that. For larger systems, it's a very common practice to do, a sample of the data set, maybe 10 gigabytes, 100 gigabytes, migrate that, do your testing on that, and then extrapolate out what the scale would look like if you migrated all the data. That can dramatically speed up the process of testing, whereas if you're migrating tens of terabytes of data, that can be expensive because it requires a bigger pipe, so you end up using large express route circuits, and it can also be time prohibitive because the testing might take longer. If you have to find out if a report that runs in 2 hours is operating optimally, and then you run the report, it runs in 2.5 hours, then you have to adjust scale and rerun the test and hope it takes less than 2 hours. That's great if you have that kind of time, but most environments would see a benefit in reducing that testing time. And the way to do that is to sample the data efficiently for that particular application, then run tests and sort of extrapolate out based on scale. Now, whether that scales linearly or exponentially, that's going to be something you would have to know by knowing the usage pattern of the database. So hopefully your developers and your DBAs can help with some of that. So after you've done your schema, your pre-prep phase, pre-migration preparation, you will be in the data migration phase. The recommended pattern is to use the database migration service to do this. The database migration service is a little bit overkill. If you're only doing one database, and this is your first database into Azure, then I would stick with the data migration assistant and let it do the data migration. If you want to do lots of databases, or this is a production system, I would use the data migration service. So the first thing you'll need to do is create and configure the migration project. This includes registering the data migration resource provider. If you're not familiar with what that is, we've got the commands to do that. You can also look in the Azure portal under your subscription, and you can see what resource providers are registered in your subscription. Usually Azure will automatically register the resource provider on your behalf if it's not already registered. I usually recommend that you just do it manually just to make sure that it's already there for you. You'll create your migration project. You'll choose whether it's going to be an online or offline migration. This is one of the things we talked about a little bit earlier, but offline basically means that you have downtime that you can take advantage of, and it will do the entire migration offline. So if you have all weekend to do your migration, it might be an offline migration. If it is a 24/7 application and you have to minimize downtime, you would obviously choose online migration. You'll specify the migration source and target service. These are going to be the fully qualified domain name or IP address plus the credentials that you need to access the database. You'll need control server permissions to access the source server. And then on the destination, you'll need control database permissions to access that. Most of the time, people just use an administrative account, which will have both of those, both levels of permission. You'll select the source and target database mappings, specify validation options, schema comparisons, data consistency, query consistency. Then you'll run the migration and monitor the progress. Pretty straightforward. This can take a varying amount of time. It's strictly dependent on the size of the data. You will need, typically you'll need some type of connectivity set up as well. So how you do this connectivity-wise depends on what your requirements are for connectivity. In most environments, you're going to need to set up a virtual network in Azure, and that virtual network will need to be we'll need to have either an express route connection or a VPN connection back to your on-premises source server. And then you'll need to have a private endpoint defined for the destination service on that virtual network. That's mainly a condition of security. So that is perfectly valid. If you need to do that, you can completely encapsulate it so you're not going out over the public internet with your data. So one thing to keep in mind. If you're doing an online migration, cutover is going to be pretty significant, so we'll talk a little bit more about that. But if you're offline, you just reconfigure applications with the new database connection details and bring them online for the cutover, and that should give you the cutover you need. If you're doing an online migration, that means that the data migration service is replicating the data on your behalf in the background. You'll have to select Start Cutover. You'll need to stop incoming transactions on the source database. You'll wait for the pending changes counter to show 0. Then you'll select Confirm, click Apply to stop syncing the changes, and then you'll reconfigure your applications to connect to the new database connection details. So it's not the online cutover, not a full 100% online. If you need something that's a little faster and a little more, little less downtime than the data migration service, you're looking at doing one of the custom options, which I will show you in a few minutes. All right, so let me pull up the data migration service. All right, so here what I have is a SQL Server that I have actually spun up in Azure, and this is a SQL. Technically, it's a SQL Server running on an Azure virtual machine, and I have spun this up to represent my on-premises environment. So there is, think of this as me being a DBA, and this is my on-prem environment, is this SQL Server that you see right here. So I'm currently logged into this. So this copy of Windows that you see is this actual virtual machine called SQL Coho DW. And I call it SQL Coho DW because this is a data warehouse that I use for another lab that I just deployed. So let's take a look at what I have before I open up the Data Migration Assistant. So on the SQL Server, this is SQL Management Studio. I have a SQL database called Coho DW. If you want to take a look at it, this is actually a renamed copy of the AdventureWorks data warehouse. So it has all the same tables. It's just been altered slightly to accommodate the migration process. So basic, you could do this in your own subscription pretty easily. Just deploy a SQL Server VM. I believe this is SQL Server 2017. So let's take a look at that. SQL Developer Edition, version 13, which is going to be SQL 2017. So that's what we're working with. And what we want to do is we want to migrate this to an Azure SQL database. And so I've already created the SQL database. And if I look in my Azure subscription here, I have a Cloud SQL environment. And this is the environment I would like to migrate into. And I have Coho DW, which is a blank database. And let's go ahead and log into this. I log in with my administrator account, and if I expand tables, you can see I have no tables, no views. Well, there's a firewall rules view, but no user tables, no user views. So the goal is migrate my entire database to this Azure SQL database. And I'm just going to show you the single database scenario first. This is the easiest way to migrate a database. There are some tools built into Management Studio where you can right click and migrate it to a SQL VM and things like that. I'm going to ignore those for now. And we're going to use the Data Migration Assistant to do this. Now, I've already pre-installed the Data Migration Assistant. It takes a few minutes to install, so I didn't want to bog us down with a bunch of installation problems. So when you launch the Data Migration Assistant, you're going to get you're going to see this screen here. Now, I've already run this tool once, but you'll notice that it doesn't show me any of the assessments that I've done so far. So let's go ahead and load an existing assessment. I'll click Load Assessment. I just stored it in the default location, which is in your Documents folder. And I'll open that up, and then it will show me my assessment. So I'll open that. And you can see in the assessment that I ran, it has a couple of options here: SQL Server feature parity and compatibility issues. So let's look at feature parity first. It's going to flag a few things here. Unsupported features. So it says Azure SQL Database doesn't support analysis services. Migrate to Azure Analysis Services. So if you have Azure Analysis Services on the same instance, the recommendation is going to be to migrate that to Azure Analysis Services. So that's a different topic that we'll cover some other time, but that's an option. It also flags reporting services, and it doesn't support Key Vault integration currently. So that's the options that it's flagged for this one. Now, this particular database doesn't have any compatibility issues other than the fact that it's saying that there's a feature that's not supported. So when I do this migration, there's some feature that's not going to be supported. If I had things like incompatible data types, those types of things would be flagged in here as well. So it will flag anything that isn't caught. Things that it won't flag: difference in results. So if you are upgrading a database version at the same time as you're doing a migration to Azure, it won't know that. It's not going to know that, right? So it's not going to know that the result set is different. It's not going to know that your query changed. It's not going to tell you about plan changes. So if you have a performance problem after the migration, it won't know about that. It's going to know about all the known issues. It's going to flag those things. You see down here, I have a button where I can click. It says upgrade to Azure Migrate. If I was doing database migration service, which is encapsulated by Azure Migrate, that would allow me to put that assessment into Azure Migrate and track this migration through that. So that's all cool stuff. How did I get here? So let's go ahead and do another assessment real quick, and just kind of walk through the process of getting to this point. So the first step in creating an assessment is going to be creating a project name. I'll call it my assessment. Assessment type. I have different options: database engine and integration services. This will migrate SSIS DB to Azure SQL Database for you. That's a little out of scope for what I wanted to talk about today in this webinar, but just know that to use that feature, you're going to migrate your SSIS DB into an Azure SQL database, and then you will connect to an Azure Data Factory SSIS feature to that SSIS DB after migration. And that's how that feature would get leveraged. But for our purposes, we're concerned with the database engine, so I'll choose that. It's going to ask me the source type. I can choose SQL Server or AWS RDS for SQL Server, and I can choose the target type. And you can see it's given me Azure SQL Database, SQL Database Managed Instance, SQL Server on Azure VMs, or another SQL Server. So we're going to choose Azure SQL Database. I'll select Create. It's asking me what type of reports I would like to generate. So I'm going to just go ahead and take the defaults. There's some new preview features coming that will allow the data migration assistant to identify features in Azure SQL Database that you might take advantage of. So for your reference, even though I'm not going to be able to do that here because that feature is not yet available yet, the types of features they're talking about are the various security features that you can take advantage of in Azure SQL Database, automatic tuning, those types of features that can help improve the manageability and the performance and the security of your SQL database after migration. So I'm just going to take the two defaults. I'll click Next, and it's going to ask me to connect to the source server. So I'm going to choose my local server, and since I'm on that machine itself, I'm on my SQL Server itself, it's not a remote connection, so I'll just choose SQL Coho DW. Windows authentication will work because I'm on that local machine. Once it connects, it'll query the server and get a list of the databases, and you can see the server name is SQL, the instance is SQL Coho DW. The database I want to look at is Coho DW. You can see here in Management Studio, that's this database right here. So I also have the option of adding trace files. So if I need to evaluate queries and things like that, it will do that. Again, it will tell you if it has a known compatibility issue, but it won't catch things like if the plan changes and causes a performance degradation, it may not know about that. So be aware that even if you do pass in trace files or query examples, those are not necessarily going to catch everything. I don't have any for this system because I don't really have any load running against the system anyway. So I'll just leave that there. I'll do a start assessment, and it'll come back pretty quick. Now, if you added a trace file, this assessment would have taken a lot longer because it needs to process the trace file and read through the entire trace file. Be careful with that. If you give it a 1 month, like a trace file that covers about 30 days, it's going to take forever, and it may never come back. It may fail before it ever, and time out before it ever comes back. So you can see it gave me the same report that we just looked at before, but that's how you run the assessment. Basically, go in there, add it, give it the target or the source server. It'll evaluate the source server and come back with recommendations, and then you can go remediate that. You can rerun the assessment as many times as you want. It has no impact on the underlying server, very little impact at all. So you can rerun this whenever you need to. And you can see compatibility issues just gives us the same breakdown. The different tabs that it's showing you are different versions of SQL. So the different compatibility levels for the database itself. So if there was, this allows you to fine tune what you're migrating to from a compatibility level standpoint. That's all that's telling you. So by default, you're going to be at compatibility level 150, which is 15, which is the current version of SQL. So now let's do an actual migration. So I'm going to click new, and this time under project type, I'm going to choose migration, and I'm going to call it my migration. The source server is going to be SQL Server again. Target server is going to be Azure SQL Database, and I'm going to let it go ahead and migrate the schema and the data. This is going to be an offline migration. Online migration, very similar. It's just got a much, it's mainly designed. The process will be very similar, except at the end, you'll have a few extra steps if it's an online migration. So let's click create, and we'll connect to the source server first. SQL DW, we'll say Windows authentication, encrypt the connection, say connect. It's going to ask if you want to do an assessment. We'll go ahead and do the assessment again, just for completeness sake. Now, for connecting to a target server, I have an option to create a new Azure SQL database on the fly. I'm going to go ahead and choose an existing one because it's a little bit faster for our purposes. So I'll choose my Coho DW 9607 database. I need to choose SQL authentication because this is not a domain joined machine, and I'm not logged in with a domain account. So there's no way for me to do that, to do Windows authentication at this time. I'm going to pass in the admin credentials for this database. And I'll say connect. And it'll connect. And I've already created a database there. So it is, it's going ahead and pre-populating that for me. Coho DW. And it should prepare the database schema. Now, if it found any issues in the schema, it would flag them right here. In my particular case, it doesn't. But there are situations where you might have incompatibilities in the schema, and you'll have to fix those before you migrate those. If you're in a testing phase and it's an unimportant, a relatively unimportant database, you can always unselect the table that has the compatibility issue in the schema. So I'm just going to go ahead and migrate everything and then generate SQL script, and it will generate a SQL script for me. There's an alternate way to generate the SQL script, which I will show you. If you want to do a more manual generation, you can also go into Management Studio and you can right click and task and generate scripts. And you can also walk through the steps here. We're just going to select the entire option. Save to file sounds good. And then you can see it's generating the entire script, and then it'll ask us to save the report, and that will generate a script as well. So a couple of different options for generating a script here. I usually stick with the Migration Assistant. It gets updated pretty frequently, and it also flags things, gives you an extra couple of checks before your migration. Once you're done with that, you can just select Deploy Schema, and it will give you a report here. It says deployment results, 99 commands executed, 0 errors. Now you can just click Migrate Data. It will give you another report showing you the row counts of all your tables, whether they're ready. These are just there for you so that you can kind of help, put a sanity check on there, and then you can start your data migration. You can see it gives you a nice little readout of what the progress is, how many are successful, how many are in progress. I don't know exactly how long this is going to take. Probably on the order of 5 minutes or so. I think that last table is fairly large. There we go. So you can see here that sales by region table is pretty large. So it's taken a little bit of time to do that migration, and it'll go through and upload our data into our SQL database. We'll give it a couple minutes to get sorted out. While it's doing that, I'm going to jump in to the portal here. I'm going to close this guy. And the reason I'm closing that is just so I can go back in and see the refreshed table information. I log in and I expand my tables. Now you can see that I have all my tables in here. So select top 1,000 rows from the dim product table, and it should show me results. There you go. So looks like it's doing a pretty good job. Almost finished with that last table. I'm pretty sure it's going to succeed, but that's basically how the data migration assistant works. A little cleaner than just randomly uploading your data and seeing how it flies. This will give you some sanity around that process and at least catch all the known issues that you might see in migrating to Azure SQL Database. Now, if you were doing this through the data migration service, the benefit there is you basically get the same functionality except across multiple databases simultaneously. So you can migrate groups of databases. Common question, I've got a SQL instance on-prem, I've got 10 databases, they're not really related. How do I migrate those? And do I need to migrate all those to separate database instances in Azure? The answer is no, you don't. You can migrate those to separate instances of Azure SQL Database, but then put all those into an elastic pool, which will allow them to share resources, and that'll be very similar to what you had on-prem. And so long as you don't need to do cross-database queries in those smaller databases, that usually will suffice. If you did have to do cross-database queries, you'd be looking at doing the same process, but going to a SQL managed instance. If you use the same data migration assistant across any of the other database tools, it's going to be a similar look and feel. The process will be identical. You're going to get similar warnings, errors, and just a different set of known issues that it checks against. All right. So let's go ahead and jump back. And I want to wrap up today by talking about a couple of other migration options. Now, I've called them advanced. I told you earlier, they're probably better off calling them alternate database migration options. And these are things that I probably wouldn't recommend for migrating to Azure. And there are more options than I'm going to cover here today, but I just wanted to cover the very database specific options that you have. So if you're migrating SQL Server on-prem to SQL Server virtual machines, you have other options as well. Basically, any technology you would use to migrate from one SQL Server to another SQL Server can be used to migrate from a SQL Server to an Azure virtual machine running SQL Server. So backup and restore, you could use transactional replication if your database is compatible with that. You could use an always-on availability group if you want to absolutely minimize the downtime. That's another popular option. The downside of using these, it's manual. You're going to have to do all the checks, all the assessments. Now, you could combine this with the assessment tool in Database Migration Assistant, and that will give you the option to run these run the assessment and then do the migration how you see fit. If you're minimizing downtime, I would probably go with an availability group for minimizing downtime, especially if you need failover to be as quick as possible. The caveat I will put on all of these is that if you are going to migrate using any of these manual methods, I highly recommend that you script every step of the process and test the entire scripted migration end to end, because user error is the most common issue when dealing with these types of migrations. There's various reasons why you might hang up an availability group, or you might do something that causes it to take longer to fail over. So I highly recommend you script all of these. Things like availability groups. The idea here is that your application is active until the minute you're about to fail over. And you have a hybrid availability group. And when you do a hybrid availability group, what's happening is you have asynchronous replication into Azure from your on-prem server. And then when you're ready to do your cutover, you basically want to tell your application to stop submitting transactions, or you do it when you know your application has very few, if any, transactions. And then you switch your availability group into synchronous mode, and then you fail to Azure. And the benefit of this is that because you switched it into synchronous mode before you failed over into Azure, that means that your replication is still intact. And when you fail into Azure, you can switch it back to asynchronous mode, so replication will now take place going backwards. And that gives you a fallback. And that's the only big advantage to doing it this way, is that it gives you an easy way to fall back to on-prem if something goes wrong in Azure. It's probably pretty unlikely that you would need to fall back to Azure unless you just didn't do due diligence in planning. So keep that in mind as well. For SQL Server to Azure SQL Database, a couple of other options you have. You have export and load via a backpack file. I don't recommend you do this, but it is an option. A backpack file includes all of the objects for the database and the data itself. If you're going to use this method or the data sync method, I highly recommend you scale your Azure SQL database up as high as you possibly can, or as reasonable, so that you get maximum load performance to minimize the amount of time it takes. Also note that a backpack load can time out after 24 hours, and if it does, it's basically going to destroy your entire migration and you'll have to start over. So be aware of that. I would highly recommend you avoid that scenario and use the tooling when you're migrating into the migration tools when you're migrating into Azure SQL Database. You can use SQL Data Sync, which is a feature of Azure SQL Database. However, it is not a recommended migration path. The recommended path is to use the Data Migration Assistant or the Database Migration Service. So this is just if you need some type of manual control, that's the direction you would go, is using SQL Data Sync. One option I did not cover in any technical detail is for data warehousing. if you are going to move to Azure Synapse Analytics, which used to be called Azure SQL Data Warehouse, the recommended way to do that outside of the migration tools is going to be export via BCP on your on-prem systems, copy your BCP files or CSV files into an Azure storage account, and then load those files via Polybase. That's for larger data sets. If you have a small warehouse, you don't need to go through all this, and you probably wouldn't use Synapse Analytics for a small warehouse anyway. If you have a really large warehouse, like 10 plus terabytes, then I would recommend at least considering Azure Synapse Analytics, and then you'll do your load via technology called Polybase, which can do parallel loads into the same table, and it distributes the data around the entire cluster that supports Synapse, your Synapse instance. Again, a little beyond scope, but just know that that's out there if you have a warehouse load that you need to work through. So that concludes the presentation portion of our webinar. If you have any questions, you are welcome to, I'm going to unmute you guys, but you guys are welcome to put questions in the chat or ask questions out loud. There's a lot of things I didn't cover. We could do an entire 5-day class on how to do database migrations. So we covered everything in a little over an hour, which I think is not too bad. But hopefully this gets you kind of pointed down the right path for doing database migrations. Does anybody have any questions for me? All right. Well, if nobody has any questions, I will drop my email address in the chat. And you guys are welcome to send me questions offline after the event. And I'd be happy to answer them in email. If you have a specific proprietary question that you want to ask, that's perfectly fine. You can do that over email, and I can talk with you then. Other than that, thank you guys for attending the Migrating SQL Workloads to Azure webinar, and good luck on all your Azure endeavors. Thank you.